I'm very happy that you all came. It's my honor to briefly introduce you to where you are right now. I think that's also important to say. And we are also helped by the help from Berlin Science Week. So that's a satellite event by the Berlin Science Week, and we're very happy about their support. And yeah, so. First of all, Maurice here. So you were in the office of Maurice here. We are a startup that is three and a half years old, and we are all about. That's why we're here, I guess. And what we are doing is we are building a platform for early stage research. So we consider everything early stage that is coming before a publication. So you have on our platform posters, presentations. Abstracts from conferences, for example, and we offer analytics for all people that are interested in having them. And I'm very happy to now introduce you very briefly to our panel, but they'll yeah, and we should do that in the cinemas. Please turn off your cell phones. Thank you. Well, the advertisement. Exactly, the advertisement. We have places for advertising. So first of all, the topic of the panel is knowledge utopia, right? Maybe before we go into the panel, just for us to understand who is in here. So maybe give me a sign of hand if you're a researcher. Maybe start with that. Researcher, wonderful. So do we have any ex-researcher? So do we have any publisher here? That's good, very good. We have any technology provider in a broader sense? I'm looking at here. All right, very interesting, good. Okay, did I miss any group? Any librarians, I'm sorry, librarians. Oh yeah,
yay!
your targets, yeah. Right, did I miss anyone now? Students. Students.
Yay!
Brilliant. Okay. Wonderful. All right. Thank you all for being here. So we try to create a very diverse panel so that we can diverse in the sense that in color of skin or in let's say where you're working and we almost achieved that. So we were before we were starting the panel, we were trying to look where are the extreme positions in order to have a very vivid discussion here. So I'll actually leave it to you to introduce yourselves and give us kind of a brief introduction of two words in what you are and where you come from. Yeah, please, Sven, start.
I feel bad that we don't have equal distribution.
Yeah, that's a big problem.
I think we have other criteria that distinguishes other than gender. So.
That is true, but I was just talking about gender.
Good. So I'm Sven Fund. I am working in academic publishing since 15 years, I would say. I started off at Bertelsmann in corporate development. That was not academic publishing. Then joined Springer, what is now Springer Nature, in 2004, in a process which we could discuss, which was a buyout by private equity companies. Very interesting phase, and very interesting change that happened. Then moved to, and I worked in different positions there in Switzerland as the managing director for Birkhäuser, which is an imprint that does arts or architecture, but also science. As a managing director for Springer Vienna and as a board member for the so-called small legal entities. It's that sexy, small legal entities in Europe. Then I left Springer and joined the Kräuter, where, for example, we met, and I met Gerhard as well in 2008. Became managing director there until 2014 when I got fired, which was an interesting experience. And then launched my own consulting company, which is called Full Stop in 2015. And I'm very much involved because that was one of my interests already at the Kräuter in open access. And I bought basically Knowledge Unlatched as a company, which is a provider, and we can get into that a little bit later, of open access funding, I would say, in 2016, I believe, and that's what I'm doing right now, alongside consulting in completely different fields, which I find really interesting. So to do open access and science and research publications, but also what I'm doing right now, for example, arts publications, which is completely different, yet very interesting as different parts, basically, poles of the field.
Thank you.
And now you?
Yeah. So my most differentiating criteria today is that I actually work for a public university.
Doesn't matter. It's all fine.
I work for at Freie Universität Berlin, and there I have two jobs. For one, I'm the open access representative of the university, so I basically do open access advocacy within the university to make sure everybody knows what options they have, how it works, try to get people to the light side, you know. And my other job is basically doing the same for all of Berlin. So it's something called Open Access Bureau Berlin, which exists for almost 3 years now, where we try to coordinate the open access activities of the big universities, of the Fachhochschulen, and to some extent even the museums and archives. By training, I am a literary scholar, so I study German literature, and I always wanted to become an editor. When I started my PhD, I funded an open access journal, so I was an editor there. Then I moved on, working as a managing editor for another journal that was half open access and half published with De Gruyter, until De Gruyter hired me from there to work for them, where I finally had the job of my dreams, which was to be an editor for literary and cultural studies. And after 2 years, I hated the job so much.
You didn't say that back then.
No,
You said that too.
no, we didn't discuss it back then.
That's
But and I didn't hate it that much. But I used to work at a commercial publishing house, and I quit, and then I moved back to work at the public university at Freie Universität Berlin, where I'm doing what I'm doing now. And I'm very much interested in the tension that is between public infrastructures and infrastructures that are owned by companies, etc.
Yeah, thank you. That would be a good topic for after the introduction. Thank you. Jan, please.
Yeah, hi, I'm Jan. I'm the entrepreneur here in this group, or one of the entrepreneurs. My background is I wanted to become a researcher and just figured out I was really crap at it. So I did business in school. I wanted to study physics, then went on to study business. Then I started a PhD in computer science, and it just didn't work. But whilst I was doing the PhD in computer science, I figured out that researchers in our world have really so many problems in terms of the lack of tools and the support, and it's difficult to find the content, it's difficult to access the papers. Our world just sucks in terms of providing access and technology, and if you compare it with the world of Facebook and let's say Instagram or Spotify and Netflix, it's also easy and smooth and convenient and it's fun. Not in our world, it's just always tedious. So what I did is, instead of finishing my PhD, I dropped out and started a company called Mendeley. And Mendeley is a reference management tool. It was meant to be an open science platform, but the reality of a startup is you end up in a path dependency. And the problem for people to just organize their PDF documents is so big, which we hadn't imagined when we started. We had quite a big idea of what Mendeley could become, but as an entrepreneur, path dependency, you have to be pragmatic about it. We went after building a very good tool for researchers that's accessible. You can just go there, download it, somehow gets closer to the standard of what you would accept in this industry. And we did this for about 5 years and then got acquired by a company called Elsevier. And that's an interesting thing because, when I started Mendeley, I must say Elsevier was one of the red flags for various reasons. However, when we discussed with Elsevier, there were good reasons why we agreed to this, and maybe there would be actually, we'll not tell too much about that now, but the idea was really, if you can't fight it from the outside, why not fight it from the inside? That was essentially the idea. And I do think we've made tremendous progress within Elsevier, so I stayed there for about 4 years to get them on board with, we need to have good tools in this world. So I was, again, very pragmatic about that. And then after 4 years at Elsevier, I felt very corporate's getting slow, still so many other problems in this world. And one of the next problems that we figured out was access to research papers. Because it's still cumbersome. You as a student at university or researcher, you don't know what you have access to. And if you don't have access, you don't know whether maybe a preprint exists. Like, it's really, again, a pain. So I went on and built a company called Copernio, which is supposed to do exactly that. It's a browser plugin. You can sign up with the institutional subscriptions. No matter where you go, it will pop up and tell you whether there is a journal article available to you, whether that's through subscription access, open access, or preprint. It doesn't matter, because for the researcher it just matters, give me that damn PDF. That got acquired earlier this year. So that got acquired.
It's another option. This company isn't the only one that does that.
The fight begins.
This company got acquired this year in April by a company called Clarivate Analytics. So I'm now part of Clarivate Analytics, trying to build Copernio, give it to more users, not needing to go out there, raise money by myself, and all this painful stuff and inefficient building a company. And that's it. And within Clarivate Analytics, I'm now also responsible for a whole new thing, which is the Web of Science. Some of you might know. And figuring out, there's a lot of good data in there. How can that data get out to more people? Because that's kind of what the community wants, but the company so far hasn't been really able to get that data out in a broader fashion. So that's kind of my background.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you very much.
Cool. Hi everyone, my name is Gerhard. I'm a biotechnologist by training. I got a PhD in chemistry. Kind of like Jan, I realized lab work, it's great on the theoretical basis, but it's kind of lonely and tedious in the lab. So I decided to not finish the academic path, and then I became an editor in Munich at Oldenburg, which was at the time one of the traditional science publishers for textbooks in the engineering field and the other fields. So I was doing this for about 2 years for books and journals. Then Oldenburg got acquired by De Kruiter. They offered me a move to Berlin, so I thought, always wanted to go to Berlin.
Sven is hoovering up.
I know, so I kind of did the same work here in Berlin, acquisitions editor for books and journals, mostly in the science and technology field. So basically that means you go to professors and tell them, hey, write a book or be an editor with us because we're better than the other ones, and build some connections to institutions. Did that for about 5 years altogether, and then I thought, okay, the learning curve is getting a bit flat, and I wanted to have a bit more freedom. And I started being a freelancer in science communication. So I write, and I also now work for Intake Open, which is an open access book publisher. And they started an office in London this year. They started as a robotics journal in Vienna many years ago, and now they're one of the big open access book publishers. And I'm doing commissioning and program development for Germany, so I can give you some insights on how open access is being perceived from the German professors, and I think there's a lot of education to be done from what I get. So we might be very knowledgeable, but I think a lot of even high-level academics, they are not that known. They don't know too much about the details of open access yet.
Yeah, thank you very much. Interesting. Well, there's a lot of topics that we can just pick out now and kind of discuss. I think.
I was about to say like boom.
Yeah. We need like 4 hours. Is that okay with you?
When are the pizzas coming?
So, did you order this? So there's. You see already there's a lot of, I guess, M&A activities in here, so Sven bought literally everything.
No. Boring stuff. No, I didn't say that.
Let's talk a little bit about the dynamics that are happening now, right? Open access it seems that it's a big movement that is starting now. The European Union with the FLANS somehow made a big move now. So from 2020 there will be big changes. Sina, this must be the best news ever, no?
Yes and no. I mean, the one thing is that it's great that open access has reached a policy level where people basically can't not do it. So it's great that a lot of countries in Europe have committed to making open access a reality from January 1st, 2020. So that's great. We have reached a policy level and there's some perspective. On the other hand, what was really annoying is that a lot of people reacted with, oh my god, really open access is happening, what are we going to do now? When there have been people who have been working on this for 10, 15, 20 years. And actually, on the level of the European Commission, 2020 as a deadline has been set 3 years ago. So we're already talking about this a lot. A lot of institutions are already aspiring to raising their open access level. So it's kind of like a two-sided sword. And I think it's very important that we have policies that mandate open access, but for very good reasons, the German research community is not part of this, because they say we do not want to force it. We do not want to force the researchers to actually do something that they do not want to do. And in my daily work, I see very clearly what the difference is between a researcher that wants to know how can she publish open access because she has to, and someone who says, I want to do open science because my work benefits from it. And I think the latter part of the open access advocacy work, I know, please don't quote me on this, but it kind of got weakened with Plan S. So we have these two sides of the coin. It's going to be a reality, but it will be harder to make sure that people are actually in it full on.
Right. So you're mentioning basically the big communication problem that there is, where how to educate people on the open access. This is something that you mentioned also in your work, that the people don't really know what it actually is.
I'm actually really astonished. You would say a professor who's dealing with publications all the time, he should really know the details. And then normally I send either I know the people and we have a call, or I send an email, attach a flyer or a little presentation, and then you get those really, really basic questions like, so what's the benefit? Why shouldn't I just put it on the university server in a repository? So why do I need to pay all this money to publish it proper open access? And then you explain, hey, you get indexing, you get all the dissemination, your work will be much more visible than if you just put it on some tiny institute site. Who's going to look for it? But I feel like the real benefit for many people isn't that clear, and they have some, sometimes you get this, I get all those invitations to conferences and to invitations to publish in that obscure journals, so we really need to convince people that it makes sense and that it has a value. And I think that's one of the challenges for every open access publisher, because there's the traditional publishers on one side who have a history and reputation, and the smaller ones, they always seem, people are a bit weary. So I guess that's a big part, education and also building trust.
All right. So you worked a long time for a publisher. Maybe give us a little bit of an insight from the publisher's perspective on what is happening on their end, and maybe to differentiate also what are the big publishers doing, and maybe also kind of the vision of the smaller publisher where open access is maybe also threatening.
Well, I think the opposite is the case, to start with the last point. I would say that smaller publishers are usually more innovative when it comes to open access, when we talk about traditional publishers, so not new launches. I would say that the small publishers are probably more innovative about open access than the big ones are. I mean, starting with Elsevier, who was really the reason for open access, I would say. For that reason, probably was never affirmative about it until recently, when they came out and said, we will be the biggest open access publisher in 2 or 3 years, and everybody laughed about it. So I think small publishers are awfully innovative when it comes to open access for books, which is a completely different segment from journals, how open access is being done. I would say that there is a number of university presses that most of you have never dealt with, like Duke University Press, for example, where I would say that they are awfully innovative and risk takers really about open access. I think that is a topic across the board. But I would say the interesting experience with reaching researchers is that publishers suddenly feel that they really have to educate their authors in their own interest, in their commercial interest, but also in the interest of developing programs about something which they have never done before, about basically converting from one, let's call it business or access model, into another one. And I think that the compliance on the policy level that you mentioned is obviously important, and that funders like the Wellcome Trust, for example, have pushed people with a lot of money by just saying, don't worry. Here's the money, you just go for open access. That has helped in a lot of disciplines and with a lot of funders. It's more difficult in the humanities and social sciences, where people are always doubting whether they should really do that, what it means to their copyright, and I guess all these questions that you're addressing every day in a university. But I think what's really interesting is that there are probably now more publishers who are active in open access than there are libraries spending money on open access. And I think that is the next wave that we have to achieve now. Not that just people just talk about open access, and I have to say Freie Universität, right? Freie Universität is one of those places that have been active relatively early on, but there are still major universities that don't do too much in open access, beyond journal APCs, where the funding oftentimes comes from other sources, like from the Wellcome Trust, from whomever. I think it is really important now to form a common view of what we want to achieve as a space, ecosystem, whatever, to really push for openness. It is not about polarizing between publishers and libraries, but it's really about creating a single view or a united view on something, and then really implement actions for that. And if publishers, if libraries are not complying, fine. Let's push them out, that's fine. But instead of fighting all the time about small details and the latest twist on whatever CC licenses, I think it's really important to get traction and to make it a broader movement when it comes to content, because I think that is what researchers worry about. They don't care about the way how somebody pays somebody else, but rather how they get most openness and most content.
I would say, I've been thinking about this as well, trying to agree like a common standard on open access, but even though I've worked at Elsevier for 4 years, I still never left kind of my view of the end user. And when I started in this world as a researcher, and then in the Mendeley world, which is also not publishing but technology, it took me so long to even understand what open access meant, because then you have the green open access, you have hybrid, you have gold, you have bronze, and it's like from an end user perspective, and I think maybe that's a challenge. Why for researchers it's so hard to understand, because the nuances are so, it's not just
and then you
subscription access and open access. No, it's like, and there are 8 different versions in between. At least that's how I think I perceive it as an end user, and that makes it very difficult. I think for researchers to just say, oh yeah, okay, open access is this thing, is very easy. Yeah. And then you have the case of predatory publishing, right? In particular in open access, where people hear a lot of hearsay. And where people get concerned, well, if I have to pay and then it's a predatory publisher, how can I make sure? And I know these are like trusted big brands, Nature and whatnot. So I think the open access movement in itself is not doing itself necessarily favor, because it's such a diverse discussion.
Absolutely. Hey, I have an idea. Let's just sell everything to Elsevier, so everything's in one big hand, and like they can deal out all the services.
It doesn't even stop there. Then you tell them, oh, and then we have a partner who's doing library crowdfunding, and they're collecting funds, pledging money, and then you could get your book for free, and then they don't really get it. So who's paying money? Why are they paying money if it's free anyways? So I mean, the whole concept is kind of abstract, and for people who are not really, who haven't really dealt with it, it might be off-putting, or they just say, give me an easy explanation, and I don't get it. Green and gold and diamond and whatever. So,
and I think there's one point about what Jan says. Everybody hates Elsevier, especially librarians, but what they do first is renewing Elsevier subscriptions. And that is something that is not just cynical. I think it's very logical. There is a reasoning behind that, why it works that way. And I completely agree that we need to get better in this open access world. I studied history, by the way, I don't like the word movement too much. So in this open access world, I think it is really important to focus on the things that are doable, on infrastructure, on providing bandwidth for certain topics, and not just coming up with the next esoteric invention of something. That is always great, but it is simply not the way how you can turn $25 billion in library budgets every year if you do it in like $5,000 steps. That is impossible. And I think that doesn't mean that it should be not creative and not innovative, but I think the big publishers and the business models of the big publishers really benefit from the situation that everybody else is rather trying to fight with each other about small little details and small changes, and not really attacking those business models that should be removed to create more openness. And there are many of them.
I don't know where to start. I mean, I think one thing that I find very, very important is that you talked about researchers get confused about when they have to pay what to whom in order to make their stuff open access. Article processing charges is not the only way to make open access, right? 73% of open access journals listed in the Directory of Open Access Journals do not charge article processing charges. It is possible doing it in another way that will not be where the author or her institution will not receive an invoice in the end. There are other ways of doing this. And I think the discussion about open access has been dominated by this model because this is the model that the big publishing houses use mostly and benefit from the most. And I'm not yet saying that benefiting from it is a bad thing, but these are just the discourses that we're working in. And I think once we get that clear, we also realize that we can't make it easy. It is a difficult process, and there will be no one-size-fits-all solution. And what's happening right now, which is really interesting, is not only that researchers get confused about gold, green, bronze, hybrid, diamond, open access, and actually if you break it down to just gold and green, they're usually smart enough to actually get it. Yeah. So they're not just confused by that, but when we start talking about open access and business models in academic publishing, this is actually the first time in their academic careers that they realize how much money is in the system, how much we are paying the publishing houses, the big ones and the small ones. And this is a shift in mindset, which is new and which is super exciting and which can actually lead to something that fosters change on a different level. On the other hand, of course, you cannot ask from a regular postdoc student that she puts her career on the line just to change her publication system.
We can disagree on something finally, Christina.
You think she should put her career
No,
on the
no, no.
line?
I'm just trying to say that there is not a lot of money compared to research spending in the publication part. If you look at the budgets of the German Research Foundation, I'm probably not getting the numbers 100% right. You can look it up online. Just as an idea, do you know how much money the German Research Foundation spends every year? It's about 1.3, 1.5 billion. Do you know how much they spend on publications? 60 million. So
How much percent is that?
that is something like 3 to 4%. And I would say that if we would always discuss 3 to 4% of every budget that's being spent publicly with the same intensity as we have discussed open access over the last 15 years, and I have to admit I was part of it, that discussion, then I think we are getting something wrong. We need to get more efficient, and I completely agree with you. It's really interesting going forward how a mixed business model, if you want, funding model, economy in open access can work. And I think that will be the challenge. And what we should also discuss in open access is, are there certain components of research publications that will and should never be open access for economical reasons? Because no, not just that, but from the size of the target group, from the specificality of an interest, whatever it might be. But looking at it from a financial perspective, isn't there a limit of what should be open? Because how many things in life are 100%? And why should that be a good solution for research publications? I don't know, but I would just like to see numbers on it and not just gut feelings and all these kinds of things. I think it's really important.
Let's talk a little bit about that. That touches on the point that we have discussed a little bit before, the very capitalistic aspect of that industry. We talked a bit about that. There's a lot of private equity activities in the industry, a lot of mergers and acquisitions. You talked about efficiency on these very capitalistic structures. So, what is your view on that? Where should it go? Should it be all not so private, and should there less PE activities in that entire industry?
I think the short question that I want to ask is if a company is driven by pleasing their shareholders, can they actually strive for openness? Like, are these two ideas actually compatible? And my claim would be that they're not. That the mindset that is behind making a profit and the mindset that is behind sharing are so fundamentally different that those companies with such a setup can never actually provide the best services for openness and research, because they have boundaries of what they can imagine.
So I would assume that Jan, you would disagree a bit on.
Yes, I do. So I mean, is of course, you know, being open is a kind of we had these discussions a lot also with Mendeley, and you know, we always interpreted openness in the sense of, okay, we want to provide a tool that people can just go and use, right? So open in the sense of making it available for anyone who likes, without them requiring to pay or, you know, jump through hoops and hurdles. You can just go and take the tool, use it, and you get some basic service for free. It's not open anymore at some point, because if we want to keep on building that thing, which apparently made a lot of people happy and solved a lot of problems, then yes, I think it's reasonable to say we want to charge some money for that, right? I mean, the way you go to the supermarket and buy a liter of milk, you don't get that for free. You don't actually get anything for free. You have to buy, like, outright the whole liter. And that is why, kind of, in particular, like, I like my job as a tech entrepreneur. You are in the digital space, and you can just, like, innovate something and figure out whether that works or not. And many things actually fail, right? So that is in terms of openness of the tool. Now, the other thing that, like, we were always publisher neutral, in the sense of we didn't care so much whether, you know, someone would download a PDF that is subscription content or open access, because our view was, as an end user, I have the PDF, organize my PDF. What we wanted to do is give the data that we aggregated out to the community and have them use that data and see what they can do with that. And now Mendeley is a big part of, for example, Mendeley data is part of the Altmetrics evaluation process, for example, right? It helps institutions to understand how they can optimize their subscription portfolios and actually potentially cancel some of the subscription content. So open, like, I don't think we have necessarily helped with Mendeley, in particular the open access publishing model, but I think we've made a difference in people thinking around where there can be some sort of open platform that I can go and use, and there's some open data. So that's how I would say there is a possibility to make something more open, not 100%, but something more open than it was before, whilst having a commercial interest in what we did. So that's kind of how I saw what we did there. And I think Kubernetes is actually the same.
To add a general comment here, I think on an individual basis, every researcher thinks, what's in it for me? They're kind of opportunistic. So if they're starting out in their career, they probably just go, where can I place it, which has the highest impact factor? And they don't even care if it's open access or not. Some people might have a political opinion and they want to promote it, or people who already have high status, they can say, oh, from now on, I have my Nature and Science papers, I just only do open access out of principle. And I think it's changing, but if you're a professor or not yet there and you're starting out, I think those are also very important considerations, and maybe more important than is it open access or not, or what kind of, or who's paying for it. So the whole system with the impact factor, which doesn't make sense in many disciplines, for example, applied science or tiny communities, they can never get a high impact factor, but open access is picking up, but I guess some of the big journals who are leading the field, they're still subscription-based journals, and that's an important aspect to change over the next years.
Yeah, what I would like to add, I think this discussion about striving for profitability or for a business model or not is really funny, because what universities are doing in their research funding is trying to find third-party funding from Siemens, Volkswagen, or whomever.
And they're also trying to encourage commercialization of things that got invented at the university itself. So I don't think, I mean, I would be surprised if anyone was just in general against commercialization.
Yeah.
But
No.
And I think I think we all agree on that. And I think and by the way, the Max Planck Society and all the big supporters of open access don't make their patents open access. They are still commercial, even though they have been paid for publicly as well. So in that respect, I think it is not really a dichotomy between kind of a for-profit world and a privately funded world, but I think it is a question of ethics, and I think that is something that needs to be regulated and implemented into the system. So you have to say what is legitimate, what can a company, not just a publisher, but also somebody who produces railways for public services, what is the profitability that we want to allow at the intersection between private and public goods. I think that is what it comes down to. And we have seen that privatizations when it comes to water and gas companies in cities can be a disaster. We have seen that the public side of banks, West LB for example, can be huge disasters which are unbelievably expensive for the public. So I think it's just a question of how can we implement in the research publication and research system a level of a differentiator of what's legitimate and good and what should be funded and what not, and not so much the structure behind them. I think that would be my core interest, and I think it is really important, as Jan said, that there are entrepreneurs putting their private money into something that fails, because the public is not paying for that. The public is just paying for a service that hopefully works then, and I think that is a big benefit that we should be interested in. If we have no entrepreneurs anymore that are interested in doing something differently than they did in the past, then it's boring. And I think research publications are probably a field where competition is an issue, because all of these journals are little monopolies, or book series or programs or whatever. I think that is a problem, and that is why I think with openness, what has to come is really transparency. You need to really make services comparable and interchangeable, exchangeable. I think that is what really is important, at least to me. Because if researchers continue to publish the way they have done over the last 30 years, and if they don't change their behavior, and I think that's what Mendele tried as well, if they don't change their behavior, nothing will change. You can basically pour the money on the streets or not give out, spend money on anything, but what has to be changed is really like the social practices of publishing, and we need to ease that so that it's easy for people to move from Nature to another journal which has the same importance to them.
So the topic of that is knowledge utopia, right? So you're mentioning some aspects of that already. In such a global environment, which it is, do you have an idea on how to implement exactly these measures?
Well, I think the first point is that academic publishing is only global to a very small extent. So if you look into Nature and Science and these journals, that's undoubtedly clear in small disciplines. If you look into humanities publishing in France, it's almost isolated. There are language barriers, or publishing in Japan, for example. At Knowledge and Ledge, we have tried to extend the model to Japan, and they said, this is a great idea, but only with Japanese language content. Well, who are we to do that from Berlin? I think that's probably a difficult one. But I think the difficulty is that rolling things out globally need a certain scale, and that's, I think, why it needs larger publishers, because they have the muscle to do that, and they have the pressure from the market right now to do that. And at the same time, we need to make sure that all these small publishing houses finally get started on innovating. Not just on open access, but on data publishing, and all these, on discoverability, on all these kinds of things. So if this market drifts apart, as it has done over the last 15 years further, it will be really, really difficult for researchers to operate in that.
Yeah, I think about knowledge utopia, whatever that exactly means. But the way I thought about that is, I think what we need to do is, coming back to what you said, is helping people understand the nuances of all of that, right? That there are different options, and for that, I think what we need to do is increase transparency, and that has historically been lacking, right? You only had kind of your typical journals and your way of doing things, right? And I mean, trying to justify what I'm doing for myself every day is I'm trying to do exactly that. I'm trying to build software that helps people understand where there are different options. Try to reveal some of the data that we can gather to make people look into, well, there are other things, and help to identify other data points and help people understand, well, there are ways of doing it differently. But with an immediate benefit for the end user, because otherwise, I feel like it's very difficult to reach end users just by saying, I want to explain something to you, rather than to explain to them, well, if you do it a slightly different way, here's the following benefit for you. So to make it more tangible. And that might not always work, and some people are just simply not interested in that conversation and they just use the feature. But in Mendeley's case, what we did there is we had a Mendeley advisory community. We had, like, in the end, about 5,000 people spread around the world who we told about, well, there is all this data available, and give us feedback, what do you like, what do you dislike, and so on, right? And that is a voice also now actually inside Elsevier. I mean, I left Elsevier a while ago now, it was like 3 years ago. But that is a voice inside Elsevier, and they never heard that before, right? And so that keeps up the pressure as well to some extent. So that's kind of how I try to approach this in terms of how we move forward by creating more transparency and tangible benefits for researchers that help them understand their other options.
Would you agree to more transparency and putting some frames of what can be open and what should be closed?
Yes and no. I think more transparency is definitely the way to go. Like, we need to know what we're paying for and why. As to what should be open and what should be closed, I think we're hitting exactly one of those boundaries of imagination that I mentioned earlier. Because the stuff that can't be done profitably open has to be done not profitably open, which is always an option,
For example, like peer review, if someone needs to organize it, it needs to be proper. And I mean, some people do it because they feel a pressure to do it, but it takes a lot of time. And I mean, you can't really get all this quality assurance for free. That's just one issue a publisher provides. And then, of course, language editing and the technical sides, the platforms, just the manuscript preparation process and all these things. I mean, some authors, they just always take it for granted, and they say, hey, I deliver it, so what's the service you actually provide, and how can you justify charging £10,000 for that for a book? And to make that more clear, brings more acceptance and more understanding.
And publishers have been really bad in explaining their services in the past. That is coming back to us now. So what came out of it was a book, but what happened in between, or not, has, I think, or a journal, I think has been very poorly explained in the past. By the way, I feel that peer review is one of the biggest myths in academic publishing. I wouldn't say that it marries at least more than 10% of the time of discussion it gets, because I've been working for different academic publishers, and I can assure you that the quality of peer review is not what people make out of it in public discussions.
And that's not a new insight. It has been scientifically proven that you cannot scientifically prove that peer review actually does anything. Basically.
Not at all.
Like, not at all. Like, if you have good editors that have a good, research ethic, they can do just the same things. But we're getting very far from the question that you originally asked me before you interrupted me, which was about the knowledge utopias. And I think that's a very important thing. I want to get back to these boundaries of imagination, because all three of you have mentioned things as kind of thresholds or problems that we can't push past in order to get open, because it's difficult to create an international market, because researchers want to keep publishing in the journals that they have published in before, or because it's so difficult to explain stuff to researchers. And I truly think that the open mindset allows you to just think of alternatives that you cannot think of once you have the entrepreneurial mindset, when you can't just break out of the structures. I mean, there's a kind of like a quip, a joke that keeps going around in the community. It's like, sorry, we can't accommodate your business model from the 19th century anymore. And this is something that I feel we need to embody. Like, there is no reason why we should keep working with journals. There's no reason why we should keep the concept of a publisher intact. I'm not saying that we should abolish it. We know they have benefits. But I think we are now in this very exciting place where we can actually question all of that. And I think we can only question that if we place ourselves outside of the dichotomy of non-profit and profit, because we don't know where the best answer lies yet.
Yeah, and it allows us to ask the question, what do we need libraries for?
Exactly.
Absolutely, we need to discuss that as well, because it has a lot of cost implications.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
very good. Now it's starting. I feel it. And it's exactly that point where I would like to open up the discussion and would like to ask if you guys have a question for our extraordinary panelists. And I saw you have already one. So go ahead.
So let us look at the business model, like being an accessory and now doing my business administration. I look at the business model as being focused at somebody, but whereas the end user has really no clue about the whole story. Let's take any young researcher who is coming into the laboratory, sits with his peers and say like, we search in SQL, we search in IEEE, something like that, and has no clue about the value of the research publication which he or she is accessing, because at any point in time, this person is the end user, but somebody else has to pay for it. But when a person does not know the value of what he or she is accessing for free, but somebody else is paying for it, now there is a clash. At the same time, when you are into the later stages of research, when like I was in some kind of suicidal thoughts because I was not able to find the research thing that I have downloaded and I have to study to them, Mendeley came really in handy. I think I was like using it in the time of 2015. From there on till now, so it gives you a way of tracking, but it's really difficult to understand why you cannot communicate this business model to the end user so that everybody has some kind of consciousness when they try to use it.
Yeah, I must agree. Like when I stumbled into this industry, and it was not my. I mean, I didn't say, oh, I want to work in scientific publishing, right? When I did my PhD, it just like stumbled. I was pulled into this through Mendeley. But I completely agree. The dynamics in this industry, and we discussed this as well with Monty, is amazing that this even works the way it works, right? You have the publishers with the institutions, they do their big deals, and the institutions at some point they write a big check of $1 million. The publisher says, okay, thank you very much, see you next year. And then you have the researchers, and they're being left alone. And so that was how and it's absolutely true that I was like, how can researchers not understand, or how can we not make this transparent, but because researchers are being used to this way of doing things like that, now if you want to make a change to that, it's quite a comfortable situation for a researcher actually, right? I write my paper, I submit it, I don't have to pay anything, all is being taken care of me, and then you have the output, right? And ideally you get citations. So we need to just incentivize differently. We need to provide them other tools to do things differently, to behave differently, to make it more convenient to do things in a different way. Because if we don't take that into account, I think it will be very difficult.
You want to do?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that we're here right in the middle of something that's very, very important about the field that we're talking about. And I think you've kind of mentioned it in passing, both of you, that we're not dealing with a regular market, right? Like, you used the word end user a couple of times, and we can imagine the reader as an end user, we can imagine the author as an end user, we can imagine the library who's actually paying the bill. That's what we need libraries for, paying the bills. As an end user, so this is already confusing. And then the people who uses the product is very often not the people who actually pays for the product, as you also pointed out. And then as you pointed out, there are quasi-micro monopolies down to the level of a single journal. And this is why I feel like if we try to think in the logic of markets too much, we miss a lot of what's going on, right?
Yeah, probably, but well, it's probably my entrepreneur head. It's like I'm always thinking about okay, I get the point. Of course, there can be policy changes, and I do agree with that. I think we see a lot from the funders changing, and particularly in the last couple of years, and that needs to happen too. But if, I personally as an entrepreneur, I can't wait for that. I have no time to wait for that. I need to solve a problem. I guess so. It's not saying either or. I guess it needs to somehow, go hand in hand. When we started with Mendeley, we already thought okay, how quickly will open access develop? Because part of the idea of Mendeley back in the day was in fact also trying to address the access problem. Now you get pulled into this reference management. 10 years later, this problem still exists because open access unfortunately has not had the traction that maybe some people thought it would have. And so you still have that problem. And so again, I can't wait. I mean, of course I would say if we had only open access, then we wouldn't need something like Copernio. I would do something different. But now we still have subscription access, so I can't wait for open access to come true. I need to solve the problem of you, right? Because that's something very realistic and pragmatic. But I think we need to address this also from a policy perspective, and I do think that funders become more aware of that, and politicians as well. It's just like, for me as an entrepreneur, I want to get things done and problems solved.
Right now it's a system that's kind of a symbiosis, and everyone is adapting to the other players. And if that makes sense as a whole, that's maybe not so true anymore.
Parasitical than symbiotic.
I know, but everyone is kind of feeding off of each other, and there's money somehow getting funneled in, and everyone gets a piece of the pie. And so,
Isn't that great?
Yeah. It's like,
I just want to get more concerned. You had a question.
Thanks. The way that you portrayed it before was as if publishing is this easy thing that researchers are able to write their articles and publish. But I mean, it's super competitive and it's super stressful, and if you're working on a topic that someone else is working on, you publish too late, then you can't publish at all. So I think open access also is very important in terms of negative results and in terms of results that are maybe not, that you can't sell very well because they're maybe not very popular. When you're working together with companies who funded your research, but then they're not happy with what you come up with, they don't really want you to publish it. So I think there's many cases where what Christina was saying actually is exactly the case, that this idea of profitability is in direct contrast to publishing and to openness and to sharing information, because that can lead to losses in commercial terms if it's about certain companies or certain practices or also other publications. So I think in terms of the competition that is inherent in research and in academia, commercial publishing will never be able to do it justice because it's not compatible in terms of how it's structured. So I'm wondering if there's any alternative to open access and to open science, in the sense that it has to be disconnected from the commercial interest, because this will always be its limit.
I think it's maybe we need to differentiate between commercial publishing and being commercial. Because, for example, if I think about commercial, again, I do think commercial in our industry has its place. Like, look at what you guys are doing in Maurice. If you didn't believe there was a commercial opportunity, how would you get the funds together to try and surface all this conference stuff, what's going on, right? By now, people go to conferences, they put up their posters, 3 days, have chats. After the conference, they go home, roll up the posters, and the knowledge is gone, effectively, because the poster sits in the office. So now, because somebody has figured out, well, why can't we just digitize that and then provide it on a platform? I think, to me, that increases the pie of stuff that's out there that's to share.
I need to add on that. So I think our view on that is as well. I think that the openness of what, so we offer the platform very openly, right? You can access it, you can browse through it, you can get access to all the negative results, which is a very important part of what we do, because on conferences, most of it actually does not make it to a publication. So we actually have a lot of things that would never be there, and yet we are a commercial company, and have found other ways of commercializing than closing content and just.
I wouldn't agree that the issue of whether a publisher can make a profit or has the idea of making a profit of a certain piece of content and the result itself are interlinked. I know not too many cases of journal articles that haven't been published anywhere. I think this, because there is, precisely because there is competition between different players, there are so many journals. So I think we shouldn't link, I wouldn't link these two elements together, because if you look at rejection rates and if you look at publication rates, if you want, I wouldn't see the risk really that this system, that the fact that the system is a commercial or a capitalist system hinders publications. I would say it's rather the opposite. And I think for me the question is more, don't different players allow for more variety to researchers? It is great that if researchers have access to welcome funding, it's easy for them to publish open access in whatever kind of journal to a certain cost level. There are subscription journals where I think there is a justification for that, and I would say that there is also room for repositories. But frankly, we only have 2 librarians in the room. Do you want to tell us that repositories are the future of academic digital publishing? I hope not, because I don't know any that are up to the standards of what Elsevier or Springer or Wiley or whatever of these nasty big publishers does.
And let's make them better.
Yeah, why not? Why don't you do it then?
We're working on it.
Yeah, right. But they have it already, and you are working on it, and that's exactly the point. I think that is the point, to say they have reached a level of professionalism already, which is there, which is tangible, which is real, and that's good. And I'm not against repositories. I think they have a completely different role, by the way, than Science Direct does. But I think it is good to have options and different models, and in that respect, it's good to have both sides of the equation.
You wanted to comment before? Was that the comment?
No.
No, I mean, there's this big thing in my head. We're talking about knowledge utopias, right? And the thing with utopias is, in order to imagine a real utopian, ideal, a dystopic world, you have to apply some level of naivete. Like, you have to be a little naive to imagine that people could actually, live in peace and harmony and like everything goes well, as much as you have to be naive to think that everything will go like completely downhill. But what's funny is that in this discussion, the people that are being told that they're naive are usually people like me. And I have been told that. And the community has been told that publicly also quite expressively, that it's naive to think that we can make stuff open, that we can find a way to do it without publishers. And I find it funny because when I hear you talking, I think, oh my God, you are so limited in what you're thinking of. It's kind of like naive to think that, the market will solve it. That's kind of what's behind all of this. Why? Like, and also to say, why the publishers have already built great solutions, so you have been too slow, so let's just stick with whatever they did and give them all the money. That is not a valid argument.
No, that's not the point. But the point is, if you have, I think for utopia, so I think to criticize something is fine, but to come up with a better solution is even better. And the question is, what is the better solution? What is the alternative, the better alternative, as they say in the Harvard Principle? What is the better alternative to the model that we have now? I think we all agree that there are good and bad things in this space, and that we obviously want to reduce the bad things and foster the good things. There's no doubt about that. But the question is, what does it help researchers at Freie Universität or any other place tomorrow to have these conversations? I think that's what the core of the conversation should be. And in that respect, I'm probably too pragmatic, like Janis. I'm sorry.
But that's what Christina meant, because she said the utopia is not only tomorrow; it's way beyond tomorrow. So if you only think about tomorrow, yes, you will only be able to think in this small frame, in this limited mindset. But if you think beyond tomorrow, then you will think about more possibilities.
That's true, but that doesn't reveal. That doesn't. I think that doesn't mean that you don't have to come up with a better solution. If you just say we have to criticize something, great. But what is then the utopia for the year 2035, when I will most likely retire? And what is the path?
And also in between, what, like for next year and for 2 years, there still needs to be maybe incremental steps. Like, I don't know, you go to a conference, a few years ago you just had those walls of paper posters, and now you get nice big screens and you slide and you can, so there's some progress, but I don't really see there's a one or another kind of view. You can be pragmatic and idealistic or utopian. I mean, it's just it takes a while to get from here to there. So.
Yeah, but for example, with the conference process, sorry to criticize your business
That's
model,
okay.
but you can upload them on other public or discipline-specific repositories for your conference there. You don't have to use Mendeley, you can use Zotero. You don't have to use, Copilio, you can use on paywall. Like, there are actually solutions that are created by open communities that are out there, and if we work towards making those better collectively, and if maybe you have fun in solving problems, and maybe don't need to worry about your income as much, why don't put your energy into those projects that are open source, that are open for the community?
You have to worry about your income.
I can tell you.
I do. I'm not sure he does. Like there are other solutions, and I'm just very afraid to just keep referring to these corporate-owned solutions when there are other solutions that, if we set our mind to, it's collectively we could maybe make those good enough to meet Sven's standard.
I can tell the answer to that. So just you know, had I wanted to go after the money, I would have become a McKinsey consultant or investment banker, given the business degree that I had. So I was certainly never interested in the money in the first place. I was interested in doing research. Figured out I couldn't do it well enough, and found Mendeley, right?
They don't like people without a PhD.
Yeah, exactly. No, that was really the thought. Like, do a PhD, I can still go to McKinsey. So I was never really in it for the money. I was in it because this super annoyed me. I had to go there, pay EndNote like $200 because University of Cologne wouldn't subscribe to it. So, okay, I go and build it myself. So, in fact, we did look at Zotero, and we engaged with the developers of Zotero, but it was impossible to move the conversation forward because it was incredibly slow, and it was very, I must say, very narrow-minded. It has to be done just that way. And we said, fine, if you think it has to be done that way, no problem. I don't think it's the right way. I'll do it that way because I think we can make this a lot better if we take a slightly different approach. And in fact, we had for many years a two-way sync. At some point, Zotero didn't maintain their sync with Mendeley because they didn't have the development resources. The sync broke down and whatever, right?
Well,
So
it's
you
because you
put-
encrypted your databases.
Yeah, that happened. Unfortunately, that happened
Right.
like this year or something, right?
Right.
And I do think the community complained about that. And had I been at Mendeley at that point, I don't think I would have said, okay, let's encrypt the database. Nevertheless, the tool is still out there. But just to give you the very pragmatic example of why my experience with, why does Zotero not work for me? I have these examples, and the same is true for UnpayWall. I think what UnpayWall has done is amazing. They've started to work on this at the same time as we did. And in fact, it's integrated in Web of Science. We, as a company, Claravit, I have to say no we because I'm part of Claravit, we actually gave them $200,000 to start. We were the people who gave them the initial money to even just build that.
Thank you.
Yes, I think it's good, right? So there needs to be money, and it's good that there is this money, but it's not going far enough because 80% or 60%, whatever number you take, is still unfortunately subscription access. So how do we get that stuff to people who need subscription access? So UnpayWall took care of the open access piece, and they do really well in doing that. The other 50% is what we've done with Copernium. We integrate with subscription access, and we do exactly the same that UnpayWall does for subscription access. And by the way, we also piggyback on the UnpayWall infrastructure, and we make it even better. So it's not either or. It's like people use Zotero, people use Mendeley, they can do two-way sync. People use UnpayWall, we piggyback on UnpayWall. So I don't think it's either or. But I feel like it needs to be together. And when I think about this utopia thing, if you're, as an entrepreneur, not visionary and try to aim for something 10 years down the line, you'd rather not even get started. Had I known all these challenges that lie ahead, all the stuff that's being thrown in my way, had I not been naive, I wouldn't even have started with Mendeley in the first place. I would have gone to McKinsey and said, fine, fly business class all the time.
Seriously, I would like to integrate the publisher's opinion.
Yes, one of you said that, I think it was you, Christine, that there's another way to fund open access besides the APCs. I'd like to know what exactly that is, because I don't think there's going to be enough revenue from advertising to do that.
No, of course not. First, ditch the idea of revenue. And then think of that consortia or communities that are interested in having a certain journal, for example, published, pooling their resources in order to fund that journal. Like they basically either pay a publisher to then pay an editorial team, or pay to have it funded without a publisher. So communities who are interested in having a journal published pool together to fund that journal. This is how the Open Library of Humanities works. And this means that you don't actually have to have an invoice in the end that is on a per article level. You don't even have to break down your costs as a per article level, which is probably a not very good way of doing business and writing invoices anyway. So, yeah.
I would agree, but
Does that make sense to you? Or
It does make sense to me, yeah. But
yeah.
What about
You don't like it. You think it's naive.
I never said that.
And that's just one way of doing it.
And just another point about the repository stuff like archive, the archive, the chem archive. They also need money for the infrastructure that they have, for the servers, all that infrastructure. Every article that goes on those, I think for archive, I think it's something like $20 or something like that. But they rely heavily upon donations from people. So, I mean, that's just one part where it's not going to be as cheap as people think. the infrastructure has to be paid for
Yep.
maintaining it, upgrading it, everything.
Yeah, but now you're like kind of assuming that anyone
And that's
would
without making any
assume
profit.
would assume that this is for free. Of course, it costs money. The idea is just that the places where the money comes from is like distributed equally among the community, or is distributed more among the people who have the money to fund it, versus those who are, have a hard time scraping by anyway.
When you say it's distributed, right, the payment, one of the questions that I have, because, when there's some of the open access discussion when it comes to who pays for this was, and again, because I'm not a publisher, I don't know all the details, but I have heard institutions saying, we are concerned if we have a model where, we pay for publishing because that would disadvantage us as we publish more versus other communities who are just reading, so they're consuming, so they don't have to pay as much. And I have heard there was even resistance maybe from those institutions to say, we're not such a fan of adopting that model because we have to pay more than others, even though, the others are consuming even more than us. So can you just explain more how you could think that evolving, or what you would tell these let's say, to these concerns?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very real thing that I actually have to do. Because if I sit here representing a university, working at a university library, that does not mean that everybody around me has, understood the problem. And what you're describing is very, very real. How to convince the librarian that is in charge of the money to spend money on something that will benefit not only our researchers, but the whole community, the whole world. This is difficult.
Fascinating.
Like this is a mindset that is very hard to do with also publicly funded institutions. Like there are rules on how you can spend public money in Germany, right? And if you cannot show that actually your institution profits from it, it's very difficult to actually get money to be paid. So this is another step that is actually complicated. For example, community-based or like consortia-based funding. But actually, I think Sven knows more about convincing librarians to adopt this model, right? That's what you're doing.
No, but I completely agree with you. I think what you just said, that it is difficult to spend money under certain circumstances, is indeed an issue. We have knowledge on that, and by the way, I think OLH is a good example, and I think because everybody feels that we are competitors, which I don't see at all, I think it's really good. The question is always how scalable it is. How can you really make sure that you can bring in more journals, and talking to Martin Eve and other people shows that there are limits as for any model, of course. I think what's interesting, we have just at Knowledge on Ledge done an analysis trying to connect the dots between those institutions where a lot of authors come from that benefit from the funding model of Knowledge on Ledge, so a lot of KU authors, let me call it that way, and a lot of usages from. And you can see it on Twitter, there's an analysis. The biggest library the library that benefits most on the publishing side and on the usage side is other libraries of Oxford University, which have never funded Knowledge Unlatched. Now, we stay positive and try to motivate them and acknowledge that this is something that we finally have proof that their researchers decided for this model, that their users decide for this model, and that they now have to bring money and fund it. But I think that is really something where we need more understanding, and another one is Copenhagen, by the way. We need to understand and communicate also about data, because it is important that libraries understand that this is not coming for free, and that Freie Universität doesn't want to fund Oxford researchers, I would assume. At least not if Oxford doesn't want to fund Freie Universität researchers. So I think the ideal of a consortium, a group, which Knowledge Unlatched is, it's basically a global consortium of people coming together to fund something. We see that you need a lot of tricks to get people on board. So you need tiered pricing for smaller institutions. You need different currencies to work with. You need to make sure that people are paying independently of whether it is just their history department or also their linguistics department participating in this. So I think there is a lot of naivete that Frances Pinter, as the founder, had when she launched Knowledge Unlatched. And I think we are basically trying to approach these one by one. But I think what would really help open access is if funders and libraries and whoever, so calling libraries now funders, would agree on a certain percentage of their budget being spent on open access. And we know it is difficult, but you still have to do it. Otherwise there will be no movement. If libraries don't make the commitment of moving 4, 5, whatever % of their budget into open access, it will not happen. I think it's that clear. Wellcome, Max Planck, all the other guys have already spent the money they can spend on open access. The next wave of funding has to come from libraries.
I like to
I'm just thinking about open access and current subscription models and how ResearchGate are there involved. Do you have any take on how ResearchGate might abuse open access?
No,
Because they currently
they can't.
yeah, they can, because they monetize ads on their site, which is driven by traffic that's generated through the articles that are on their site.
Can I ask something? Okay, so. I'm sorry. I just love this. I just love the stance of schooling somebody in open access. If you publish something open access, truly open, you usually put an open license on it. Which means it cannot be abused. It cannot be abused for profit. It is meant to be spread. And if you spread it in a way that gives you profit, good for you.
Well, that is the intellectual property side of it.
No. Because if you use a truly open license, the text itself can be spread under the conditions of the license. It does in no way harm the idea that it is your intellectual property, which as a concept, by the way, is not actually a legal thing. What are you afraid of? Research is there to be spread, to be read, and the acknowledgement of the original author is not under threat if you put the text itself out there with an open license that people can share it, print it, redistribute it, and stuff.
I mean, I know the issue that publishers have with ResearchGate, which is that they allege that ResearchGate is misinforming users and making them think that they can share stuff that they're actually based on restrictive licensing, not allowed to share. And I don't know whether ResearchGate does this intentionally or not intentionally, but that is the issue between, I think, those entities. And maybe that speaks to what you were asking. I agree, if there is an open access article, CC BY license, well, whoever wants it, take it, right? And then we come back to the thing that I mentioned earlier, but the problem is, it's not like either subscription access or open access CC BY. No, then you have 8 other different license models in between. The researchers don't understand the differences, and that means then, you know, if somebody comes in there and say, upload your stuff, you know, it's hard to explain the nuances and make this work for everyone in a straight way. But I know at least that's the issue that publishers have with the model of ResearchGate.
So I believe we all, or maybe one more question. No, that's the, yeah.
I think we just too much focused on access barrier and open access. I want to ask you guys, you guys believe if we are living in open access world, every paper doesn't have access barrier such as open to public. Is this knowledge utopia? I think it is independent. I think if we just talk about knowledge utopia, I think we have to focus on some kind of fundamental problems in academia. I think the access barrier is some kind of partial problems in academia. In my opinion, the fundamental problems in academia is such as incentive structure in this field. Because it is hard to evaluate each individual papers. So, so if I want to prove my research capability, I have to publish in prestigious journal. So I want to ask you guys how we evaluate such individual papers or individual research capability, or do we have to evaluate such a thing to making some kind of knowledge utopia? So.
I love that question because it's a perfect final question. So let's just go maybe one or two sentences. Let's keep it short there.
One has to start. It's like one of those things. It's a great idea, but it works when everyone takes part in it. And if only 1 or 2 people do, and they don't get anywhere, they're having a disadvantage. So it's kind kind of the chicken and the egg, I guess. I don't know. I don't have a solution right now, but maybe you.
Yeah, I do agree, of course, with what you say. There are these fundamental problems, and you know, of evaluating research, and how do you prove, even for yourself, right, that what you do, that you know, the stuff that I've spent the last 2 years on, that this was good time well spent. And I mean, my question back to that would be like, how do you evaluate whether somebody is a good friend of yours, right? You don't just say, well, because he wears always this red jacket, and that's why I like him. So what you get to is you need to get to kind of a more of a coming back to transparency. You need to be able to view more of what's going on, right? You need to see, okay, what have people contributed during conferences, even if that in the end didn't end up somewhere. What have they published, you know, in high prestigious journals? Have they taught other students? So what we're lacking, in my view, in order to also move this thing away from just the prestigious journals, is trying to give people more information and trying to then educate them about that, and publishing models and all this stuff. Help them understand that there's more than just the, you know, impact factor journals, for example. I think that would help just to surface more information, which could be also reused by other people, entrepreneurs, for example. But it will also help the assessment process. And right now, it's just like really, people sit 1, 2 years, 3 years in their room. At the end, they publish, and that's all. I mean, polarizing saying is all that exists, right?
It's getting slowly into that direction, that we also include other factors, not just the impact, but for example, how many people are discussing a certain research thing. That also gives an indicator, is it relevant or not. But yeah, there's developments, but they take time.
Christina?
I'm afraid to say that, but I agree with Jan. No.
Oh my
Yeah.
God!
That's
What is going
yeah,
on?
Let me elaborate.
You just want to be, alright?
No, so I think I do agree, and this is actually a very exciting thing about what open access did. It started a discussion not only about a publishing system, but also about how research gets measured and evaluated. I'm not saying this is the only reason for this, but this is one of the reasons that we're starting to talk about scientometrics, bibliometrics, like how do we evaluate research. And I think we need to rethink a lot of these things, and this is not necessarily connected to open access, but publishing, of course, is a part of it. And I think one thing that a lot of people are saying right now is we do not need more metrics. Like, we do not need different ways of counting things, but actually, like you would do with a friend, like not just look at them and see like how tall are they, or you know, what's their favorite color or whatever, but actually talk to them and see if they have anything to offer, another quality. Yeah.
Well, I would like to highlight another element which I think is really interesting, which is the seniority of researchers. I think also in open access, by the way, one of the biggest hurdles in my view right now is that early career researchers are probably most disadvantaged still, also in the open access environment, whenever at least both open access against the payment is involved, compared to people who have already built their portfolio, where it's already clear what they are contributing or have been contributing to, or built a track record basically in science and research. And I'm conducting right now a project in the UK, and this really comes out all the time, that there is no mechanism within the research funding and evaluation system that helps to like systematically trickle down funding and attention to these kinds of things that you both mentioned, or all three mentioned, to early career researchers. And I think that is something where I don't understand that the research evaluation world is not discussing them more, maybe because there is no discussion going on among these evaluators of research. But I think that is really important to see how can you bring great research in a very early stage, beyond MOOCs here I mean, how can you bring great research in a very early stage to the surface and give us the same visibility that people who just received their Nobel Prize or whatever get. I think that is one of the core elements, and I don't know anybody who has an answer to that so far. And I think that's really a little bit worrisome that even open access there didn't have to open that element, but just moved or shifted the issue from one element to another. Like in the past it was a limitation to publish somewhere because of peer review and networks and so on. Now it's more an issue of funding, and there I guess we could agree on that we need a special way to include early career researchers better in that system.
We could go on forever. At least I still have a big list of questions. I think we should repeat that. So first of all, I would like to give a warm hand of applause. Outside there's, I believe, some drinks and maybe some food or something like that. So you know, let's continue the discussion outside. I hope you guys will stay for a little bit and.
We'll never talk to each other again.
Thank you, Sammy.